The story I'm about to tell you tonight is not for the faint of heart. It's a tale that defies conventions, shunning the light of hope and taking refuge in the darkness of despair. A story that reminds us that not all stories have a happy ending, and that sometimes darkness can engulf even the bravest among us. In the small town of Hillwood, Nevada, legend has it that there is a ghost known as the Midnight Hitchhiker. It's said to wander along the desolate Highway 50, asking for a ride from anyone passing by at night. Unfortunately, Ben, a young photographer on a project trip, was unaware of the legend. Ben was traveling alone in an old Ford, speeding along the deserted highway, engulfed in darkness. He was halfway there when he noticed a female figure who seemed to be in need of help. His gentlemanly instinct prevailed, and he stopped to offer her a ride. The woman, named Mary, was extraordinarily beautiful, but her skin was as cold as ice and her eyes revealed deep sadness. Ben remained silent for most of the journey, but he couldn't shake off the eerie atmosphere that Mary exuded. Unexpectedly, Mary pointed to an old, decrepit house along the road and asked Ben to stop.
"Thank you for the ride. This is my home,"
she said in a tone that sent shivers down Ben's spine. The house appeared abandoned, but he didn't ask any questions. Mary got out of the car, leaving behind a veil. As he turned to ask her if it was hers, Mary had vanished. Bewildered and somewhat frightened, Ben resumed his journey, trying to convince himself that it was just a product of his fatigue. In the following days, Ben began to feel a haunting presence. Every time he looked through his camera lens, he saw Mary's face. Her presence became increasingly oppressive. Her face appeared in his dreams, in his thoughts, in his shots. Ben started to lose his sanity. He decided to return to the house along Highway 50, hoping to rid himself of the curse. He found the house in ruins and, in an act of desperation, set fire to Mary's veil, hoping it would release her spirit. As the flames roared, he felt a profound sense of relief. Back home, everything seemed to have returned to normal. Ben resumed taking photos, free from Mary's presence. He believed he was finally free, but one day, while developing his final photos in the darkroom, he saw something that made his blood freeze. In the photos, it was him alone in his car along Highway 50. But there was a figure in the shadows, a figure that shouldn't have been there. Mary was there, sitting in the passenger seat, staring into the camera with empty, sad eyes. Ben then realized he could never rid himself of Mary. He was destined to be tormented by the Midnight Hitchhiker's ghost forever. His last thought, before darkness engulfed him, was the memory of her voice, cold as ice and as sorrowful as the night. Mary's ghost was everywhere, in his photos, in his dreams, in the mirrors. Ben withdrew from the world. He couldn't work, eat, or sleep anymore. His sanity began to crumble. In an act of desperation, Ben decided to return to Hillwood, where it all began. Perhaps there he would find a way to free himself from Mary. He drove for days and nights, with Mary's ghost always by his side, silent but tangible. Upon arrival in Hillwood, Ben searched for anyone who knew something about Mary. He discovered that Mary had been a young woman who lived in Hillwood many years ago. She had been brutally murdered, and her body was found next to Highway 50. He recounted his experience to an old sage of the town, who spoke of an ancient ritual to release restless spirits. But beware, the old man warned, spirits don't like to be disturbed. If the ritual fails, things may worsen. Ben had no other choice. He gathered all the ingredients for the ritual: salt, candles, water from the old town well, and the portrait of Mary, taken from one of his photos. He went to the old house where he had last left Mary and began the ritual. The wind picked up, the candles flickered, and Ben could feel the energy intensify. He invoked Mary's spirit, asking for her forgiveness and release. For a moment, Mary's ghost appeared before him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, with a silent scream, she vanished. Ben felt a wave of relief and, For the first time in a long while, he fell asleep peacefully. When he woke up the next day, for the first time in weeks, he didn't see Mary. He returned home with hope, thinking he had finally freed Mary's tormented spirit. But once back home, Mary's presence was stronger than ever. Not only did he see her face in his photos, but he also heard her now. Her voice whispered in the wind, her footsteps echoed in the empty house, and her presence was so tangible he could almost touch it. Ben's despair grew. He realized that the ritual not only failed to free Mary but made her more powerful. Ben was now completely at the mercy of the midnight hitchhiker's ghost, condemned to live forever in torment and terror. And as much as he could run or seek help, he knew deep down he would never find peace again. Mary had become a part of him, an eternal shadow in his life. His last hope faded away, leaving him alone with his despair and Mary's haunting presence. Along the isolated Highway 66 in Arizona, we find Gary Foster, a veteran truck driver with a passion for night journeys. The starry sky above the desolate desert road, the howling of the wind against the cab of his Freightliner Cascadia van, and the unmistakable hum of the engine were his only companions. One night, while crossing a particularly desolate stretch of road, an unusual glow in the distance caught his attention. It seemed to come from an old abandoned gas station on the side of the road, a faded relic of a bygone era. His instinct told him to ignore it and keep driving, but curiosity took over. With caution, he drove up to the station. The flickering street lamps barely illuminated the area, casting dancing shadows on the weather-beaten walls of the building. Stepping down from his truck, he noticed an old 50s Cadillac, perfectly preserved, almost as if it had just been left there. As he approached, he saw a glow coming from inside the Cadillac. The radio was playing a vintage rock and roll track, distorted and resonant. The music increased and decreased in a disturbing manner, as if the antenna was picking up signals from another era. Then, something even stranger happened. A figure slowly appeared in the driver's seat. A woman, dressed as if she had just stepped out of a 50s movie. With blonde hair, electric blue eyes, and a smile that could have bewitched him.
I've been waiting for you, Gary,
the woman said in a sweet, veiled voice. He had no idea how she could know his name. Panic struck him. Startled, he ran back to his truck, but when he reached the cab, he looked back at the Cadillac. The woman was gone. Shaken, Gary huddled in the cab of his truck, but a sense of unease filled the air. He began to hear dull noises and hissing coming from his truck's radio, similar to those of the Cadillac. Jumping abruptly, he turned to look in the rearview mirror and saw the woman's electric blue eyes reflected in the mirror. After that night, Gary's life was never the same. Every corner, every mirror, every shadow seemed to hide the ghost of the woman with electric blue eyes. His dreams were filled with her. Sometimes, he saw her dancing to the distorted music of the old Cadillac, other times he heard her whisper his name, the sweet and velvety voice echoing in his ears. One evening, while trying to sleep in his Phoenix apartment, he heard a familiar sound. The radio on his nightstand had started playing a vintage rock and roll song. The same sound he had heard that night at the abandoned gas station. His heart began to beat faster. He couldn't move, he was paralyzed by fear. Then he saw her. She slowly appeared in the mirror of his bedroom, the blonde woman with electric blue eyes, just like that night at the gas station. She was smiling at him, her bright and inviting smile.
I've been waiting for you, Gary,
she said again, her voice now clearer, almost as if she were there, with him, in the room. He fled from his home that night and spent the rest of the week in a motel. But even there, the presence of the woman followed him. He saw her reflected in the windows, he heard her whisper his name when everything was silent. There was no escape. Desperate, he decided to return to the abandoned gas station. He needed answers, he had to understand what was happening. Once there, the old Cadillac was still in its place, motionless and silent. He approached the car, his heart in his throat. Once again, the radio turned on and started playing that same rock and roll song. This time, he didn't run. He listened to the music, its distorted rhythm, the words he couldn't understand. The figure appeared again in the driver's seat. The woman looked at him, her blue eyes shining in the dark. But this time, she said nothing. She just looked at him and smiled. He didn't know what was happening, he didn't know how to react. He then decided to do the only thing that came to his mind. Furthermore, he got into the Cadillac, sat next to her. He didn't speak, he didn't ask questions. Only then, the woman turned towards him and with a calm tone said,
Fear not, Gary. I mean you no harm. I'm here to show you the past, the present, and the future. I'm here to help you understand.
Those words, however, proved a trap for Gary. After the woman sat down next to him, her deep blue eyes became a blinding light, and a cold, penetrating current enveloped him. Her lips moved slowly, but what she uttered was not a simple message. The words coming out of her mouth were like a swarm of shadows, flying and twisting, penetrating Gary's heart, and filling him with nameless terror. The phrases were not only audible but also visible, like a storm of dark and frightening images overwhelming his mind. Terrifying visions of unimaginable horrors, ancestral fears, and unfathomable darkness, a mix he knew to be the true face of the beyond. As soon as the ghost finished speaking, a spectral silence fell in the old Cadillac. Gary remained still, with wide open eyes and short breath. The presence of the woman vanished, leaving him alone with his new fears. From that night on, Gary no longer uttered a word. As if that flow of dark visions had blocked his ability to express himself orally. However, even if he could, he would not have shared with anyone what he had heard. Those words were not meant to be shared, they were a burden he had to carry alone. The world around him seemed to fade. He could no longer enjoy the simple pleasures of life, like the smell of coffee in the morning or the laughter of his grandchildren. His existence became a succession of colorless days and sleepless nights, a perpetual isolation not only from society but also from himself. Gary withdrew from the world, giving up every form of social interaction. He moved to a small house in the countryside, away from the city, away from people. But even there, the presence of the ghost followed him. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw her blue eyes. Every time he turned on the radio, he heard her voice. From that moment, Gary's life was marked by unbroken silence and eternal torment. A man who once was full of life and hope now was an empty shell, a soul lost in time, a prisoner of his own silence. The Nevada highway is known for its desolate and mysterious beauty. The road, a gray artery winding through the desert like a snake, offers breathtaking panoramic views and the promise of solitude. For Emily, a young and adventurous freelance journalist, it was the perfect setting for a solo trip. She was seeking inspiration for her next article, something that would capture the loneliness and mystery of the desert. Emily hopped into her old Dodge Charger, a reliable and sturdy car that had become a trusted travel companion. With her provisions and essential camping gear, Emily set off on her journey, determined to immerse herself in the unique atmosphere of the Nevada highway. The first few nights passed without incident. Emily would stop to camp in secluded areas, far away from the road. During the day, she would drive along the highway, observing the landscape change as she progressed. Everything changed on the fourth night. As Emily drove along a particularly lonely stretch of road, a metallic noise from the car's engine made her jump. She wasn't a mechanic, but she knew that sound didn't bode well. The car started to lose speed and, with one final jolt, it came to a halt. Emily sat still for a moment, hoping the engine would miraculously start again. But nothing happened. The silence of the desert was now only interrupted by the pounding of her heart and the distant howl of the wind. With no cell signal and no repair shop for miles, Emily knew she would have to spend the night there, hoping that a passerby or a service vehicle would stop by the next morning. But the Nevada desert isn't known for its traffic. That night, in complete silence, Emily felt a sense of unease. The desert, which had once seemed fascinating and mysterious, now appeared threatening and full of hidden secrets. With every howl of the wind, every shadow cast by the moon on the sand seemed to come alive. Sitting in the driver's seat, with the car doors locked and the windows up, Emily tried to calm herself. Then, suddenly, a noise made her jump. The sound of footsteps. She could clearly hear someone, or something, moving near the car. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just the wind or perhaps a desert animal. But the footsteps continued, now on one side of the car, now on the other, as if something was surrounding her. A cold terror washed over her. She couldn't see what or who was outside. The car lights were off, and the moon didn't offer enough light to illuminate the surrounding area. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her nails digging into the material. The sound of footsteps continued, getting closer and closer to the car. Then, unexpectedly, the passenger side window shattered, the sound of the impact echoing in the silence of the night. Emily screamed, turning her face towards the driver's side to avoid the glass shards. When she turned back, she saw something horrifying. A face emerged from the broken window. It wasn't human. It was pale, with empty eyes and a wide smile revealing sharp teeth. Its long, skeletal hands reached out towards her, trying to grab her. Consumed by panic, Emily tried to distance herself as far as possible from that hideous creature, but the space inside the car was limited. The monster pounded its hands against the glass, leaving deep marks. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she frantically searched for an escape route. In a moment of sheer desperation, she opened the driver's door and threw herself out of the car, rolling onto the hot sand. She quickly got up, ignoring the pain and fear that gripped her. She ran towards the center of the highway, hoping to catch the attention of a passing vehicle. She looked back, seeing the monster emerging from the car, its empty eyes fixed on her. Its smile displayed an unnatural malice. Emily didn't stop to think, she kept running with all her strength. Her legs burned, and her labored breath mixed with her terrified screams. She had no idea how long she had been running or how many miles she had covered, but she was determined to survive. Finally, in the distance, she saw lights. A truck was approaching, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. Pushing through her last remaining energy, Emily waved her arms and screamed, hoping the driver would notice her. The truck driver, startled by the sight of a panicked girl running on the highway, slammed on the brakes and stopped beside her. The passenger door opened, and the truck driver gestured for her to get in. Without hesitation, Emily dove into the truck, immediately shutting the door behind her. The truck accelerated quickly, taking them away from the threat that remained in the darkness of the desert. As the truck drove away, Emily let herself go, tears streaming down her dust-covered face. She thanked the truck driver, still unable to find the words to express her gratitude for being saved from that nightmare. While the truck ventured through the desert, Emily reflected on the terrifying experiences she had endured that night. She wondered what that monster that had attacked her was and why it had chosen her. When they finally reached a service station, Emily asked the truck driver if she could call the police to report what had happened. She needed to share her story, to understand if there had been other similar encounters along that highway. After providing her testimony to the authorities, Emily decided to cut short her journey and return home. She had gained more than she had sought for her article. She had lived through a real experience of terror, something that would make readers reflect on the fragility of human existence and the presence of dark forces hidden in the world. The Nevada highway would no longer be just a desolate road for Emily. Now, it was a place haunted by an evil presence, a place she would forever remember as a site where mystery revealed itself in the form of a terrible encounter. It was during the final hours of my shift at the city hospital when I began yearning for the embrace of my warm bed. The clock struck 10 past 10 in the evening when I decided to make my way home. Crossing my sleepy, rural town, I found myself immersed in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of my Benelli bike's engine. I was traveling on a stretch of road quite close to my home, with a sunflower field to the east and a dense forest to the west. It was a warm late summer night, and despite being around 10:30 p.m., the thermometer still read 23 degrees. Opening the intercom of my helmet, I let in the cool night air. While I was driving at a moderate speed of about 45 miles per hour, a woman's agonizing scream echoed from one of the sides of the road, I couldn't tell which. I braked instantly, bringing the bike to a halt. From the darkness of the forest on the left, I distinctly heard a woman's cry pleading for help. Dismounting my bike, I pulled out the flashlight from my backpack. I approached the forest, asking who was there. A female voice immediately replied, "Please, help me." Without hesitation, I rushed into the woods, piercing the darkness with my flashlight. I kept calling out to the woman, asking her to continue yelling, so I could locate her. Despite my steady run towards the source of her cries, it started to become clear that no matter how far I ventured into the woods, the distance always seemed the same. Feeling a wave of apprehension, I yelled out, asking the woman to tell me her position. A few moments later, once again, a cry for help echoed in the darkness. I stopped, a sense of unease washing over me. I had a feeling I was being lured into a trap. I turned around and began to run towards my bike. As I moved away, the woman's cries persisted, keeping the same distance, as if she was following me. Was I being hunted by some nocturnal predator? I jumped on the bike and accelerated, leaving the eerie forest behind. I immediately dialed 911 to report the incident, then left the situation in the hands of the authorities. I was exhausted. After sharing the unnerving experience with friends and family, I was ready to move on. But a week later, a news report on the local evening news chilled me to the bone. The lifeless body of a woman in her 30s had been discovered in the woods by a man walking his dog. There were no obvious signs of violence. The area where the body had been found coincided with where I had heard the screams. Despite it being a large forest, I couldn't help but think it was too big a coincidence to ignore. I began to put the pieces together. The dead woman found had no signs of violence. It was possible that she had died of natural causes, maybe a heart condition or heat stroke. And if her last moments had been marked by desperation and panic, causing those screams I had heard that night? The authorities didn't seem too inclined to investigate further, as there appeared to be no sign of a crime. About 2 months later, another unsettling event happened. A local cyclist, passing through that same road, reported hearing the same types of desperate cries coming from the forest. This time, however, no body was found. The police searched again, but to no avail. The area became the center of unsolved mysteries, raising suspicions of paranormal activity. Rumors spread and intensified when another person, a landscape photographer, claimed to have heard the same agonizing cries coming from the woods. This fueled the hypothesis that the spirit of the woman might be trapped there, locked in an eternal cycle of terror and despair. The community was divided on the issue. Some skeptics argued it was just urban legends, perhaps amplified by nocturnal animals or the wind whispering through the trees. Others, however, took the stories very seriously. The road and the surrounding woods became an avoided area, especially during the night hours. The fear of encountering the tormented spirit of that woman, of hearing her desperate screams in the darkness, kept most people at a distance. Despite the divisions, one thing was certain: that stretch of road was not the same anymore. Every howl of the wind, every squeak of the nocturnal fauna, seemed to echo with the cries of a lost woman, an unresolved mystery wrapped in the silence of the woods.